When the Soviets used the phrase ideological subversion, what do they mean by it?
Ideological subversion is the slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
Do you feel stressed and unsure of the future? You're not alone. Many Americans are wrestling with doubts and concerns about the coming election and the future of America following that. Is this strife and resulting stress and doubt something that has naturally occurred? Is it possible for someone to create those feelings intentionally? Today, the Poli-Psych Podcast team is considering psychological warfare, how it has been effective historically, how it is being applied as a weapon against the U.S. Republic, and how it may be affecting you. Ken, would you begin our discussion today by introducing some of these ideas?
Sure. Thanks, Cindy. Hi, Don. The starting point, I think, would be internet. Obviously, we're appearing on the internet at this moment, and it did democratize a lot of the information flow in election year 2016. And big tech never quite got over the effect that it had. The original intent may have been to control, but it actually had the opposite effect. And the underlying theme so far appears to be the striving toward a populist conception of morality, or at least political direction. But that is a threat to the existing power structure. So it appears that there's an effort being made to re-sow division and create division to anchor binary oppositional dual party oligopoly. Really is what we had before. We had two parties that were really sort of a uniparty, a centrist overriding. Some people call this the deep state, or there's a lot of different buzzwords that are out there, but there is an underlying theme, and today in this show we'll try to get to the bottom of it and try to look at what direction, where we are at this point and where we're going. And Don, what do you think about our current status as far as the violence and other things? How does that fit into the flow of where we go from?
Hi, Ken. Yeah, thanks. I am aware of the video that we're going to introduce today that's kind of a summary of the principles of psychological warfare at the international level. And by international, I mean something that nations use against each other in order to win a war that is actually global in nature. And one of the videos that's making the rounds, I actually watched a long time ago, so I'm familiar with it. But this former Russian KGB person defected, but actually revealed the operation that at that time the Soviet Union, now the nation of Russia, was conducting against the United States. So he breaks it down into 4 stages in this video, and it's quite enlightening to watch the whole video. And he details it, and we're talking long-term view here. So that's our vantage point. We're talking about something that takes decades to pull off. And the first stage is demoralization. Educate an entire generation in Marxist ideology. Well, that's obviously something that has pretty much been completed, because right now it's becoming notable that we're dealing with the fruits of that. Stage 2 is destabilization. And then that involves economy, foreign relations, and defense systems. So what we're looking at now is a situation in which the United States has been pretty effectively destabilized, especially in terms of foreign relations and also the economy. And President Trump seems to be having some success in pulling away from that, but overall, the trend that we're in is destabilization. And the third step of the four is crisis, violent change of power, structure, and economy. Now, because this is a Marxist ideology orientation, when they're talking about violent change of power, they're talking about a shift of power towards a Marxist ideology that the young people have been educated in. So that crisis is in operation now. It isn't necessarily intended to be a momentary thing. It's a period of time. And whether or not the America has enough strength to resist the full force of this crisis remains to be seen. But that's kind of where we're at now. Then the next final stage is normalization. When this new Marxist ideology comes into power, there is a period during which that will be normalized and declared to be good, etc., etc. So these points were outlined in this video by this KGB defector Bezmenov in 1984, and that video has been around for a while, but it's recently gaining some attention. And I think it's important for us as a show that considers the psychological aspects of politics to take a close look at this. And we're going to consider a few other things and trends, but it's all today within the context of these four stages of ideological subversion.
I'm slightly amused. It's difficult to be amused by any aspect of this, but I am slightly amused by the fact that this information came out from Bezmenov in 1984. Of course, that calls into memory the book 1984, which also is a way to learn about psychological warfare, and it's a rather painful way to learn. It's a very painful film to watch. But at the time in 1984, I was a happy American, fairly young mother with 2 children and another one on the way, and was not in the least concerned that America could possibly be infiltrated and impacted in the way that Bezmenov outlines the plan. So, but I think that part of the strength of this, part of the power of this, is the fact that people feel invulnerable in their way of life and don't feel that they can be invaded or messed with. And then the subversion occurs within the context of a civilization that is otherwise safe and stable. And that is the point, to destabilize a culture, a civilization that is stable, as we have been. And as we thought that we were up until fairly recently. I don't think it's until maybe the destabilization phase or even the crisis phase. I think there are a lot of Americans who have not realized that we are dealing with some serious issues, and perhaps that some people have intended for us to experience these serious issues until very recently. I think many Americans were fat and happy, as the saying goes, and now I think people are very challenged in trying to assimilate the information that's coming through their TV every day and aren't really sure of what is happening to them and to their country.
Well, I want to ask Ken, doesn't the fact that this guy is from Russia prove that those on the left were right and the Russians are trying to take us over?
Well, I guess if we look at it conceptually through the eyes of a foreign power, that would be true. I'm going to come at that from a different angle. In the very early 80s, I was involved in as a subcontractor, and we did it's kind of a niche printed product. It was a toner for page printers that were used in missile silos, but it was sort of an unclassified thing. It wasn't a big deal. We basically had to locate the sites and then contact the operations manager, and it was a typical sales thing. But what it did do is it gave us access to the GSA. We had a pretty good GSA account, so we could use that to kind of figure out what was going on and where the where the action was as far as our product went. But I got to see some other things in that were interesting, and they were unsolicited or requests for proposals, and some of the content was based on how it was basically how to control the herd, how where is the herd going in the next 30 years. And I became aware that there is a class of controllers, literally, and I was seeing it in right there. I mean, these just the depth and breadth of these topics seemed to go with some other things that I had learned about consulting and psychology and economics. And putting the pieces together, I could see that there were a lot of people sort of working in that direction of master control, or at least trying to see where the trend was going. And that was the impression that I got. It wasn't necessarily an effort to manipulate, but I could see how they were doing it, or how they were trying to figure out where it's going to go. And I think it continued to play out in little bits and pieces when the internet became more ubiquitous, and when you could take the broad mass of people and guide them in a certain direction. So to answer the question directly, I'd say definitely it was an impulse of a highly aggregated, organized social structure, well beyond Dunbar's number, where they were dealing with people as conceptual entities. And that actually is part of the theory it happens to be the theory of Marxism. I don't know if we can look at it as a Marxist plot, or I like to take a big step back and look at it more as a superiority, as the educated class trying to attain superiority over the vast bulk of the population, and trying to grasp at the powers as to how to control the herd. Where they want to take the herd is another story, and I think that's one iteration that was covered by Desmanoff is to demoralize first, or basically unplug the existing moral structure, or at least the theory as to how to do it. And that, so I don't like to, personally, I'm not a big fan of putting label, whether it's Marxism or communism or whatever. It's something else. It's an overriding controlling impulse, rather than a populist impulse, which popular, the root of that, the linguistic root of populism. So I see it as sort of populism versus control, and that control has to happen by creating division, and then polarizing a population to the point where they're not a threat to the controlling entity. Whether it's it could be a communist entity, could be a deep state entity, could be a conservative entity, could be a religious entity. We see that sometimes with theocratic regimes, and we see that all over the world. Is again, this impulse toward controlling the herd, without reference to labels. That's Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that does, and I am actually in virtual agreement with you there. 95 or more percent. It's almost irrelevant what ideology they use. So, in a sense, this the title here of the 4 stages of ideological subversion is a bit of a misnomer, because the subversion doesn't have to be ideological. It can be basically an elitist takeover of the masses, generating what amounts to a false revolution. Not false in the sense that real people don't fight the war on the streets, or make real sacrifices in their daily lives or have a lot of turmoil. It's false in the sense that it's not what it claims to be. And of course, there have been communist revolutions throughout history that have become famous for that we now know, if we look at how they happened, that they were actually driven by a group of people at the top that were claiming to be for the people, and then it turned out quite differently in terms of it was a ruling oligarchy that moved into power. Now, I can probably count on one hand the number of times in the history of civilization that there have been revolutions that have been of a different nature, ones that were intending to give power to the people. And of course, my favorite, sincerely, not on the basis of, we're going to redivide all the property and take from the rich and give to the poor and everybody's going to live happily ever after, a fairy tale, but one in which there were well-educated individuals that understood human nature and had a firm grasp of history and sought out to design a country that functioned on the basis of maximizing the power of the individual, but at the same time preventing chaos. So that's what we've got with the intentions of the founding fathers of the American government. And I have to wonder whether or not most of the people who understand what the American Revolution was about, whether they are still sitting on the sidelines, or whether how they've realized or analyzed what's going on now. It's really a period of sifting out where some of the things that have been hidden from view are now coming into focus, and a lot of people are, to use the common phrase now, waking up and seeing things they didn't know that they were there. So this stage of destabilization shakes things loose, and we're looking at something going on behind the scenes that we hadn't seen before.
One of my favorite films is the film Branded, and it's from 2012, and it's about the concept of advertising and marketing, and it's very, very long and convoluted plot that I won't get into, but one of the things that was particularly noted in that film is that the Russian Revolution was the Marxist Revolution in Russia was the first time that marketing was effectively used, and they actually called that the birthplace of marketing. The very idea that an ideology or a way of life needs to be sold or marketed would seem to be an indication that perhaps it's really not ideal. And so I think that at that time, the marketing had to really go a long distance to affect the people. Whereas now, most people in the States and probably throughout the world are fairly conditioned to being told what to think and how to feel by media. And marketing has become such a part of our lives that it's almost impossible to separate out what is marketing and what is a genuine response or input. I think in many respects on social media, many of us are simply echoing ideas and thoughts that have been marketed to us and sold to us, and we then in turn become a part of that marketing machine to promote ideas that are not original to us. And I think very few of us can say that we actually have original ideas. Now, we may arrive at conclusions on our own. We may decide intentionally to accept an idea or a concept. But as far as actually giving birth to them, I think very few of us can claim to have had the inception in ourselves of or maybe the conception of the ideas that we have embraced.
It sounds like you're almost saying that we need to find what we decide to the way we decide to go based on marketing and which marketing we like best, or is there another way?
That's a tough question, just because of the conditioning. I know Ken probably can speak more eloquently about this than I can, but there is a distinct difference between how feelers process information and how thinkers process information. And it's easier to convince a feeler. It's easier to market to a feeler. And that it seems that most marketing companies and people who are selling ideas and products take that low road for the most part of selling to the feelers, which is all they have to do is evoke an emotional reaction, which is actually easier than persuading someone and going through the process of rationally putting out a position, explaining a position, and convincing somebody of something. So as a feeler, I'm going to have to admit to, being persuaded at times by something that is contrived to make me feel something. And although I'm aware of it, and I've become pretty cautious about accepting notions, especially the more heavily promoted they are, the less likely I am to accept them. But I do have ideologies that I have embraced. So there's that.
So you would fall into the camp of somebody that wouldn't necessarily think the way to solve the problem of redirecting a society through a psychological operation would be to change the way people think or process information. It would be to get a better marketing team for the good guys, right?
I can't say no.
We'll show the MBTI grid that I refer to sometimes to explain the next point. So everything exists in a continuum, and when we talk about, for the audience, the thinker, the feeler, it doesn't mean that we're dealing with the extreme. Although it does happen. It happens in arguments usually where people will jump to one side or the other and become unbalanced. And that was one of the themes that we were going to address in the show, is the pathology of imbalance and what happens when people do get into these seizures, which really most violent arguments are brain seizures. And you'll see either one or the other of the pole be eradicated in that context, and people will cling to, the thinker will cling to, well, that's the law, and then the feeler will say, yes, but continuum. So it's continuum versus binary. It's these two sort of different ways of sorting the world that we see all the time everywhere. We can pretty easily classify computers as being in the binary. The bit is either on or off. And then the value part is a little more video oriented, where you're injecting feeling and emotion into the situation. So to answer the question, it's a combination of the two. But what I think what mass media does is very skillfully will keep chipping away at a binary question, okay, whether this law is right or wrong, and they'll inject value judgment to that, and then you'll create a new compromise, which will soften the edge and move the goalpost a little bit. And what they've figured out, what the thought crafters have figured out, is if you keep chipping away with the values argument, like Cindy was saying, you keep chip over the course of 30 years, you can eventually completely move that goalpost to where you want it to go. And usually what you'll see with an adversary is persistence, and persistence usually does win. And as they say in chess, it's not intelligence that determines whether someone will be a good chess player, it's willpower. I think it's probably a few other things too, but mostly it's just staying in the game and having the fortitude to stay with the challenge in front. So this is sometimes referred to as the dialectic, and we throw around these words, but they're actually very simple. The dialectic was based on a German concept of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. But the Marxist dialectic was literally, I believe, from what I've heard in various presentations, that was the central theory behind how they persuade a population, is by slowly eroding or moving the goalpost. And I think we say Desmonov's demoralize is really remoralize slowly. And you're doing it the same way you would train any herd animal. And I hate to say it about human beings, but you're literally taking the herd and offering positive and negative reinforcement simultaneously to make the horse go this way or that way. And it's sadly it does work. And until you become immune to it, and that's hopefully what this show is doing, is being able to rise above the issues and all the different, we'll talk about the far left, and we'll talk about Q, or we'll talk about, they'll use these labels, or conspiracy theory, but to rise above that and see why are these words being used exactly, and how can they be exploited, and then on the other side, how can they be used to, on both sides, create the herd, the herd movement to go one way or the other. So we're trying to get a higher level of understanding to the process, I think, is where I'm going with this. So that's, Cindy, that's really how it works. And it's not, even a really intense thinker will have feelings, and an intense feeler will definitely be capable of logic. It's which one tends to win out more often than not. But very few people are pure versions of that until there's a really bad argument going, or a riot, or so, which we're seeing now. We're seeing people just be turned into herd animals, storming into a restaurant. Nobody would do that on their own, unless they're on drugs or something. And yet we'll see, we saw hundreds of people do it in Rochester, New York. It's people that normally wouldn't even consider that course of conduct, seeing that their moral goalposts were completely altered in submersion, immersion into the herd itself, and making that form their identity at that point. And that's really I think the goal of a lot of the macro, whether it's theocratic regimes, or communism was also a macro regime. Populism, not as much. I think populism has a little more individuality built into it, but you could look at that as a movement as well. And I think we're still trying to grasp exactly what is populism, and how does personal liberty fall into that. Can we combine the two some way? I don't know. That's what we're wrestling with in our culture.
Well, that does put me exactly where the point I wanted to make was how is the foundations of America, which is based on personal liberty, from my understanding, my reading of the founders and the intent behind the Constitution was to maximize individual liberty while preserving enough stability to make the nation governable. How does that get eroded over time? And I think the answer is, from what I could see, looking back over the last 20 or 30 years, is not only training up young people with a new ideology, but also eroding the old ideology, which was based on individual liberty. And how do you do that? Here's what I see that has been done. Well, if you have if you have individual liberty, that means the other guy too. That means he can be as outrageous as he wants to be, and you're un-American if you say otherwise. If you prevent him from doing things that you disagree with, well, then you become the oppressor, and so you have to stay silent while the cultural norms are moved, while the goalposts change. And this is where I think it's really key to recognize that one of the well-known quotes from America's founders, I think, was from John Adams, who said that the Constitution is designed for a moral and religious people, and it's wholly inadequate for any other. So what has to happen is for the morals of the nation to be changed so that there is not a cohesiveness in which the individual outliers will be corrected and brought back into the norm. You're, like I said, you become un-American if you say that whatever outrageous sexually deviant behavior or violation of parent child rights is that's allowed because of individual liberty. You push the envelope past the point it was intended. So I think that we can see that has happened, and that is how the destabilization part has happened, at least in part.
Well, I think you also have some, at times, the things that are pushed that are so fringe that they shock and stun everybody, but then eventually that becomes accepted and becomes the norm. For myself, I know that, and I'll just be really honest, the way I was raised and according to my belief system, I have not felt good about the homosexual lifestyle. I have had some friends who were gay. They're generally not very happy. One committed suicide. And so I'm not making any kind of a personal criticism. I'm just stating the facts. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, that lifestyle was shocking and considered aberrant to most people. And now I have a daughter who's actually turning 40 this year, and she has quite a few. She's worked in the hospitality industry. She has quite a few friends who are gay. She has absolutely no problem with people living the homosexual lifestyle. However, she is troubled by transgenders and watching that whole thing unfold. And her children are in school with some children who are going through the hormone therapy to change their gender. So when they're grown, they probably won't have, and I'm anticipating that they wouldn't really be too troubled by the issue of transgenders. And then after that, who knows what might come into the horizon. So I say all that to illustrate how people's opinions can be changed from the outside. New ideas, new concepts can be imposed upon us as a society, as a culture, and it is possible to affect change. Now, that is a tremendous power, and we would hope that those who wield it would be driven by some kind of a conscience, some kind of a hope for a bright future for humanity. But unfortunately, as we see these things play out in a practical manner, people have agendas, things that they want, and people with deep pockets are able to put forward their agendas. And I think it is incumbent upon all of us to realize that, and as both of you stated, the purpose of us doing this program today is to hopefully help people become aware of how they are being influenced from the outside. It doesn't matter how much internal integrity you have. It doesn't matter how carefully you screen your sources of information. I'm here to tell you that you're being influenced. And the more aware we are of that, the more measures we can take to mitigate that influence and hopefully to consciously move through our lives and make the choices that we intend to make, not something that's just forced upon us.
I think President Trump's election forced this out and into the open a little more. So now we're able to, regardless of which side, again, we're on the side. So, which side we're on, we're seeing that now it's an open discussion. I think they've accelerated the process to the point where we're, month by month covering things that normally would take years.
Well, Cindy was talking about this stuff is all around us. The people intending to sway us one way or the other, and sometimes we don't know that that's happening. But more and more people are becoming aware of techniques, and I'm not talking so much big picture now, like we were in the very beginning, recognizing that we're in a period of destabilization. And there's lots of techniques and ways to destabilize. So I want to go through in this Twitter thread highlighting a few of them. I'm not going to read all of the thread, but this was from a Twitter account, Absolute1776, and he suggests bookmarking this thread, and I'll go through some of the major points. And in this thread, he says, we'll be breaking down a article and hope to give you easy access to the information regarding dissecting shills and disinfo and how to recognize it, how to deceive. Oftentimes, to keep the truth buried, the mainstream media will simply refuse to report on it. So what is not being said is often more important than what is being said. So learn to ask questions and see what is being hidden from you. Then the next we have the no but crowd, the people who will get aggressive the moment you present them with a fact that's contrary to their fragile belief system. This is a form of what is known as sliding. Then there's rumor mongers. These are the people who will pass anything off that you say as a rumor. And unstated is the fact that because it's not covered in the mainstream, it can't be true. So it's a rumor, not news. The straw man. Most of us are aware of this, but here's an example. You begin by highlighting president's accomplishments, and they say he's a racist. And then if you prevent evidence that he's not, they ignore the debate altogether, basically gets you sidetracked. And that leads to the next item, sidetracking. And you're told that maybe someone told you that Hanks is a guy that likes little children, and then you're labeled as a conspiracy theory loon. Instead of addressing your claim, they immediately insult and deride you and attempt to anger you so their claim sticks. In other words, they're trying to trigger you because of your supposedly outrageous claim. Next one is pretty blunt and self-explanatory. And the guy that attacks you then blocks you. Yep. So it's like the tactics of the guerrilla warfare, where they do a sneak attack and then they're gone. So you won't win an argument with those guys. Then there's the good old hidden agenda ploy, such as all of the BLM donations are going to the political party that they're affiliated with. And the response you get is, you're only saying that because you're racist and don't want advancement for minorities. So it's the counter accusation that puts you on the defensive and detracts from your argument. There's more of these. I recommend the thread, and you'll see these a lot. And the key feature of them all is the counterattack. They will attack back rather than respond to whatever information you're providing. So in talking about rising above this, I think that the key thing here is to recognize when that is occurring in real time, and then you can say, you're just doing this or you're just doing that. And that's the reason I bring these examples out to you today, is so that you can begin to recognize them. And it's important to recognize them in enough detail that you can say, this is what you're doing, and it falls into this pattern. You can present somebody with that. Well, they will probably just not have a response or attempt to continue to derail you. But at least you've increased the awareness of their process with whoever else is listening. So I think these kind of things are useful to keep in mind. And we are in an information warfare, and we who are trying to decipher the truth in the midst of all this confusion, we are the ones that are the honest warriors and are trying to uncover the deceitful tactics. But it takes a lot of uh, stick-to-itiveness um, and skill to be able to do that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there are a variety of religious approaches to these things, and regardless of which, I think partially the reason for that is that they work sometimes um, much better than the fads, the occasional fads that come along. Is that the one thing? If you're not a believer, not or an atheist or whatever you happen to be, I don't think there's any way you can dispute the the wisdom of these collected works that have spanned thousands of years, and they do point to cycles that reemerge over and over and over again. And so, eh, just it's a repository of wisdom, really. I mean, this applies to almost all the major religions, and I think especially Christianity, because it does seem to span a much wider historical range from just like the early dawn of civilization right on through its contemporary expression. um, but that aside, I think what you do see, the dominant theme is when governmental or people in authority start to assume the power of supplant themselves with a religious entity. So in a way, you'll see certain philosophies or approaches or flags or symbols become icons in and of themselves, and it gives people reinforcement that they're part of a group, and they can submerge themselves in the herd, so to speak. So dialing up, Cindy, the let's look at the MBTI again, and you'll see that some of the thought controllers that we come in contact with as in following the news, we will many times we'll hear about George Soros. For let me just take one example, and his MBTI profile is ENTJ, and that's been arrived at through just looking at linguistic analysis and so on. It's general consensus. It's actually fairly easy to pick someone's um, MBTI profile by looking at the way they express themselves and the uh, the fruits of their labor, or whatever you want to call it. But they tend to, in that context, the controlling class, Bill Gates falls into this category, have the NT, or the intuitive thinker, in the middle portion, the second and third letters. And what that sort of does is it takes over. Okay, we'll do the thinking, and we'll do the planning. Um, the ENTJ especially I think the history goes back. We've done some other pieces on this, Julius Caesar and other conquerors, brilliant strategists, but they do tend to sometimes lack the feeling aspect of things, and they may at times let their strategic goal overwhelm their own, um, what we would call the softer side of the feeler, coexisting and harmonizing, and the values of peace and so on. And I think what we're finding now with the riots and all this is how well, or how vulnerable civilian society is to arson, for example, and we're seeing that come up. St. Louis was the most recent up problem, yesterday, and Kenosha, and uh, 20 cities in the U.S. have had this problem, and the most significant aspect of it is you almost always see fire, and it's a primordial image of fire. Originally, the spark, humans being able to harness the power of fire, and build skyscrapers and smelt metals and do all these things, and then to see that same flame used to do the opposite, is to destroy civilized society. And it opens up the possibility of partisan operations, and where you could get uh, one partisan Antifa or whatever you want to call them going around lighting things on fire, and there's almost no limit to the amount of damage that can be done at that point. So the problem we have here is, again, I mean, you could look at that as a archetype. Fire figures prominently, certainly in the Christian conception in certain contexts, and it can either be for good or for evil. And I think we've got to start looking at the moral compass of our leadership a little bit more closely, and open that up to a broader understanding of both ends of the spectrum, whether it's liberal or conservative, and realize that in the end, people really don't disagree. It's usually going to be what form of information are they being fed to reach their moral conclusions. And I think this is the problem. This is the problem with censorship, with the problem with limiting information, and the problem with undemocratizing the internet. And I think that's what I would offer. I think it'd be very difficult to have what I would call a legitimate change of direction without unplugging the puppet masters, so to speak, the people that inject these new ideas and just force feed the kids in schools. And I'm not sure that the antidote is the 1776 project. That seems like a swing in the other direction. And what I'm looking for is a more authentic middle, where we can sort of cut these thought crafters out of the picture a little bit, and not go back, but try to start to realize that not every story that hits the media airwaves is worth considering. It could be poisonous, and I think many of these ideas are poisonous. They're specifically targeting vulnerable youth who have less of an ability to put these things in context. And that's, I think, where we're going as we move forward, is to try to get a broader view of both sides of this influencing project that we seem to be subjected to on a daily basis.
In the film Branded, at the end, spoiler alert, advertising is banned, which is a really interesting development. I don't know that could actually happen in our culture and society. If it did, I can't imagine how people would make decisions. And I think I'm being objective looking at the buying habits of most people. Now, it's possible that because we have had Amazon, who will present with many different brands and different features and different prices, maybe people are becoming more accustomed to making decisions more objectively, purchase decisions. But if what you were saying, if that were to occur, if people who were, if I can use the term social engineers, if people who are trying to direct thought in a certain direction, if the plug were pulled on them and they no longer had influence, I'm a little concerned as to what people would do, how they would behave. I think that it would be necessary to have a period of time in which people were educated as to what it really means to make choices. And one thing that we just touched on, the idea of duality. We have been, as Americans, conditioned to make a choice between two. Do we like Burger King or do we like McDonald's? Do we like Coke or do we like Pepsi? And that aspect of marketing is something that has conditioned us to not begin from scratch and make a determination about what products we really need and want, but rather we're just asked to choose between two opposites. And that's where I think our education would need to come in, is to help people start from scratch and make determinations about what they need and want in their lives, and then build from there. Because I think people have become very dependent on most of their decisions having already been made for them. And we definitely want a soda, but is it going to be Coke or Pepsi? Well, that's not that difficult of a decision. I think people need to learn how to make difficult decisions, because I think that a lot of people have relegated those decisions to other places and are not able to make them anymore.
Great point, Cindy. And yeah, that is a great example of the Coke versus Pepsi. And then we have that in so many different areas of life. We have, like 2 or 3 cell phone providers, and 2 or 3 of this or that rental car companies, different things like that throughout our culture. And the interesting thing is that the more of that those dual choices break down, and then we have more choices, people perceive that as a disintegration, when actually it's a movement towards more choice, but more difficult choices. I think maybe we need to learn how to embrace that as a good thing, and give up on the idea of being fed simple choices and realizing that our choices have been artificially limited. So a big part of breaking out of this mindset control game is to be able to, as I said earlier, going through that Twitter thread, was seeing what is not being shown to you and actually seeking out alternatives that aren't covered by the major search engines, or aren't advertised, or aren't prominent. And a lot of that is happening organically through some of the development in social media. You have to search for it, but I think we see the beginnings of that kind of culture growing, and I think that's a good thing.
Well, as we move toward normalizing, which I don't think we're going to do for quite a while, um, it's a slow process. But again, it was accelerated by the change in political direction, which seems to be fairly decisive. And this is one of the reasons we're seeing the paroxysm of reaction from the other side, and their last desperate attempt to influence using methods that are now all too clear, uh, which are, I think there's a pretty clear consensus developing that rioting is probably not a good thing. So we're, you know, but nevertheless, I think the where this will eventually settle out, and we'll go around. I think this is my conclusion to it for this part of it, is that we human beings have not fully adapted to the mass, to the sheer size and weight of a really large population. And the idea isn't to reduce the population, which I guess that's been discussed in various circles. It is to more or less look at the possible shortcomings of trying to have this macro worldwide understanding about everything at one time. Nothing could be further from the truth. Humans have not adapted to media that well. I still think that they're the in the range of experience, we haven't fully realized the power of that drug, that television, or that video presentation. And we need to recognize that. I think look at the shortcomings, and become more aware of our surroundings, our immediate surroundings, and less concerned with the macro issues, because as soon as we get into the macro issues, we're going to get into these ideological dead ends. And they are dead ends because one's person conception we use all these phrases like the conspiracy theory, or the transgender movement, or Q, or whatever. You can pick anything, any one little buzzword, and it'll trigger the other side. because you're not dealing with people anymore. You're dealing with conceptual entities. And I think on a face-to-face basis, most people get along pretty well once they become familiar with each other and realizing our limitations, our extreme limitations, because right now I don't think humankind is aware of this limitation and reacting pretty violently, I'd say, in many situations to it. And they're going down to they're taking a big step down in the food chain as far as how the brain works. We're moving into the limbic system, into the anger reflex, and using that as the go-to. And I think we're getting pushed into that by these thought crafters that are up in the intuitive thinker realm, planning ahead and knowing from experience how the herd will react. And that goes back to, again, back to Desmonov's stages. They've decoded how this works, and the faster that we understand it, the faster we'll be able to transcend it and provide counterweight to it.
Exactly right, and that's exactly why we're bringing this forward. I'm going to throw in a new idea, perhaps a revolutionary idea, of something that might be happening now. One of the obviously implied things about what we're discussing when we use terms like thought crafters and social engineers is the idea that so-called ruling elites are leading the population, the herd, so to speak, into a direction that we would not want to go if we were able to see what they were doing. And so there's a lot of deception at work. And as we were saying earlier, that most of us, people that consider themselves honest people, dislike deception. They don't deceive. They're not used to deceiving. They certainly don't believe that people that are their elected leaders would purposely deceive them. Well, some of that kind of deception is actually now coming to light, and people are beginning to question those assumptions. There's even the famous phrase used by the team known as QAnon, those you trust the most, implying that that trust is misplaced. Now, that's all to say, how would you counter behavior like that without the need to re-educate the masses concerning that deception? Well, I think there's a brilliant answer that we do actually see playing out through President Trump. And I will just present this as a possibility. Some people have grown comfortable with this possibility. I am. That's why I'm presenting it. It's well known by those of us that have studied Enneagram types that President Trump is an Enneagram 3. And now the 3 is sometimes called the achiever, but also has a downside or shadow of deception. Now, in a highly evolved 3, that doesn't mean they no longer deceive. It means they have a tool that they choose to use only in certain situations. So that I present to you the idea of President Trump deceiving the deceivers. And we hear various people on the alternative media talking about panic behavior on the part of the deep state. That indicates that they've realized this. They've realized that the person that is in charge of the system now has in fact deceived them. He's not really a bumbling idiot. He's really not the buffoon that they tell people he is constantly. He in fact is on to their game. So I present you with that possibility to consider. Is it moral or good to deceive the deceivers? And that may in fact be going on right now.
Well, most military strategy is based on deception. So this is one of the characteristics of the thinker versus feeler dichotomy. And, again, it came with some of the so-called higher functioning of humans when they began to coexist to trap animals and hunt and do all these other things, and when tribes began to carry out war against each other, deceptive behavior was part of that. It's always tempered with this is the whole concept of Jungian psychology, at least, is the balance between the two. And there are 3 other dichotomies as well, but most arguments are drawn across that. But yeah, Donald Trump's ESTP is very typical expression of that. I guess we'll never know until he takes the survey personally, but ethically, we always have to say that we can only estimate what someone's type might be, and it may actually vary within context anyway. But thanks. I think we're definitely at a critical phase in American history, and perhaps once in a century type of occurrence, and it's a thrilling time to be alive, and let's see where we go.
Now, Ken mentioned some of the ancient traditions, the spiritual traditions or religions, and Christianity in particular, and immediately, because we're talking about the idea of revolution, and I personally, although I'm a Christian, I do study other literature, and one of those is the I Ching, and there happens to be one of the 64 I Ching hexagrams that deals specifically with the idea of revolution. And there is one, a lot of times the I Ching translations are a little hard to decipher, but this particular one is concise, and so I'm going to read a bit of it. And this is from the visual I Ching. And it says, the elements of this hexagram are fire under water. Fire evaporates water, water puts out fire. Similarly, the change often causes conflict, and conflict brings about change. This hexagram refers to a time in the cycle of human affairs when things are stirring up and the hint of dramatic changes in the air. In order to succeed, a revolution must be in alignment with the laws of nature and good timing. It must begin at the right moment, gather the support from a broad base of people, be guided by sincere and capable leaders, and most important of all, address a real need. The strength of the forces of change will always be in proportion to the urgency of the need being championed. This is true whether the revolution is in government, business, education, or your own personal affairs. Revolutionary change ushers in a period when chaos arises from order. Let's remember that not all order is good and not all chaos is bad. Chaos is often an integral part of the way things evolve, as any parent and evolutionary science will confirm. The hexagram reminds us to have the courage to radically change and renew the way we bring ourselves to life. In this way, we can channel chaos to your cause and unleash a new power on behalf of the good. If engaging in a negotiation, change the rules. If composing a piece of music, add the unexpected. If courting a lover, dare to be unconventional. Combat between forces of dark and light are cyclical. As such, one can become aware of these cycles and master them through preparation. In periods of drought, even wild storms are preferable to just another sunny day. A new season awaits. And thus we can begin to anticipate a better world. And that's my little tagline on that. And I think there's some useful things there to consider.
I do appreciate the ancient wisdom, and I think in closing, what I would like to share is that I do have a deep appreciation for an objective standard that exists outside of myself. For me, that happens to be the Bible. Different people might have different standards, but when we have an objective standard that exists, that's a standalone outside of ourselves, we can go back to that and use it as a gauge to see whether how we are living and what the ideas that we are accepting honestly are valid. I would go as far as to use that word valid, and we can hold ourselves and our ideas up against a standard that might well tell us that we have erred. And I think that we all must all the time be willing to accept that we may have erred in judgment and accepted a concept as truth that has been sold to us. So with that, we thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you have, we ask that you please click like. We would deeply appreciate if you would follow us on YouTube, follow us on BitChute, tweet for us, please. Our account has been suspended on Twitter, so we are unable to do that for ourselves. If you have a moment, we invite you to visit our website. And once again, we thank you for joining us. And until next time, take care.